In this episode, we take a hard look at why controls sometimes fail, even when an organization claims it has a strong AI risk program. The failure is usually not that people refuse to write policies or refuse to adopt controls, because most organizations can create documents and check boxes. The failure is that controls become performative, meaning they exist to look compliant rather than to change outcomes in the real world. When that happens, teams feel busy, audits may look clean, and risk still grows quietly until an incident forces everyone to notice. The goal here is to help you understand what makes a control practical, how checkbox behavior develops, and how to design controls that stay tied to harm reduction and real decision-making. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical control is a safeguard that reliably changes behavior or system conditions in a way that reduces risk, and that definition matters because it forces you to focus on evidence, not intention. Many controls sound strong when written, such as requiring review, requiring training, or requiring monitoring, but they become weak if they do not fit how people work. Practical controls are designed for reality, meaning they still function when people are busy, when tools are tempting, and when deadlines are close. They are also observable, meaning you can tell whether they happened and whether they worked, rather than relying on someone's memory. For beginners, it helps to think of a practical control as a seatbelt that people actually wear, not a seatbelt that exists in the car trunk. If a control is too hard to use, unclear in meaning, or disconnected from consequences, people will comply in appearance and ignore it in practice. Checkbox AI risk is the pattern where controls are treated as a checklist to satisfy governance rather than as a safety system to protect people and the organization. This can happen for understandable reasons, such as when teams feel pressure to ship, when review processes are slow, or when control requirements are vague. It can also happen when governance is measured by completion, like whether a form was filled out, instead of measured by effectiveness, like whether harms decreased and incidents were prevented. Checkbox behavior is not always malicious, and it often emerges gradually as people learn the fastest way to satisfy requirements. A team might start by doing real reviews, then shift to copying old text, then shift to treating review as a sign-off meeting with no real challenge. Over time, the organization begins to confuse activity with safety, and that confusion is one of the biggest drivers of AI incidents that feel surprising in hindsight. To prevent checkbox behavior, you need to anchor every control to an outcome, meaning you can say what harm it reduces and what change it creates. Outcome thinking forces a simple question. If this control is followed perfectly, what becomes less likely or less damaging? For example, a control about restricting sensitive data inputs should reduce leakage and reduce privacy harm. A control about human oversight and high-stakes decisioning should reduce the chance that a model's error becomes an irreversible outcome for a person. A control about monitoring should reduce the time between the first signs of drift and the organization's corrective action. When a control cannot be tied to an outcome, it becomes easy to satisfy without actually improving safety. For exam reasoning, outcome-tied controls are often the best choices because they translate governance intent into measurable harm reduction rather than into paperwork. Another concept that helps make controls practical is control objective, which is the plain language purpose the control serves. A control objective should be stable even if tools, vendors, or architectures change, because it describes what must be true, not how you accomplish it. For example, the objective might be that only authorized users can access sensitive model features, that high-risk outputs receive review before external release, or that model performance is monitored against meaningful signals over time. When objectives are clear, teams can choose implementations that fit their environment without arguing about wording. When objectives are unclear, teams may implement the easiest possible interpretation and claim success even when the real risk remains. Practical programs spend as much time clarifying objectives as they do writing control language, because clarity is what prevents the control from being reduced to a checkbox. Evidence is the next anchor, because practical controls are designed with evidence in mind from the start. Evidence is what you can show to demonstrate the control was performed and had a chance to work, such as records of review decisions, monitoring reports, access control logs, incident tickets, or change approvals. A control that requires evidence naturally discourages performative compliance because it is harder to fake consistently and easier to spot when it becomes shallow. Evidence should also be proportionate because requiring excessive documentation for low-risk uses encourages people to copy and paste to survive. For a low-risk internal use case, a short decision record might be enough, while a high-risk decisioning system might require a deeper validation summary and more rigorous monitoring evidence. The goal is to make evidence easy to produce when the control is genuinely done and hard to produce when the control is skipped. When evidence is designed well, it becomes a byproduct of safe work rather than an extra burden. Practical controls also respect the idea of control effectiveness, which means you do not just ask whether the control exists, you ask whether it reduces risk in the real context. A training requirement might exist, but if people cannot explain what data is prohibited in prompts, the control is not effective. A monitoring system might exist, but if alerts are ignored because they are too noisy, the control is not effective. A human review step might exist, but if reviewers are pressured to approve quickly and do not feel safe rejecting outputs, the control is not effective. Effectiveness is measured through outcomes and signals, not through policy language. This is where organizations often drift into checkbox mode, because it is easier to measure completion than effectiveness. A mature program treats effectiveness as the real target and adjusts controls when evidence shows they are not changing outcomes. A common reason controls become impractical is that they are designed around the governance team's needs rather than the user's workflow. If a control requires a busy team to stop work, navigate a confusing process, and wait days for approval, people will find ways around it. Practical control design begins by asking how the work actually happens and where the control can fit with minimal friction. For example, if the risk is sensitive data leakage, the control might focus on creating safe alternatives and clear rules at the moment someone is drafting or summarizing, rather than relying only on after-the-fact reviews. If the risk is harmful content in customer messages, the control might focus on required review before sending and clear guardrails for approved phrasing, rather than requiring a long policy acknowledgement. When controls fit the workflow, compliance becomes the default, and the organization does not need constant enforcement to get safe behavior. Proportionality is another key to making controls practical because one-size controls create either resistance or gaps. Low-risk use cases need lightweight controls that keep visibility and basic safety without stalling productivity. High-risk use cases need stronger controls that match potential harm, even if that means slower approval and more evidence. Proportionality reduces checkbox behavior because it reduces the incentive to game the system. When people face heavy requirements for harmless work, they will learn to minimize effort by copying old answers or hiding the activity. When people face appropriate requirements for high-impact work, they can accept the friction because they understand the stakes and see the fairness of the rule. Proportionality also supports clearer decision-making, because leaders can explain why a customer-facing decisioning system requires deeper validation while an internal brainstorming assistant does not. A practical program is strict where it must be strict and light where it can be light. Another way to keep controls outcome-focused is to design them around failure modes rather than around generic categories. Failure modes are the ways a system or workflow can go wrong in a realistic setting, such as sensitive data being pasted into prompts, harmful outputs being published without review, humans overtrusting model scores, or a model drifting over time without detection. When you name failure modes, you can design controls that directly interrupt them. For example, if the failure mode is over-reliance, a control might require clear guidance about limitations and require a human accountability point for certain decisions. If the failure mode is drift, a control might require monitoring against defined signals and require reassessment after significant changes. If the failure mode is leakage, a control might require data classification rules and prevent certain data types from being used in unapproved tools. This approach makes controls feel relevant because people can see the specific bad outcome the control prevents. Practical controls also need clear ownership, because controls without owners turn into rituals. If a control requires monitoring review, someone must be responsible for reviewing it and for acting when signals change. If a control requires periodic reassessment, someone must be responsible for scheduling and documenting it. If a control requires human review before external release, someone must be responsible for ensuring that review actually happens and is not quietly bypassed. Ownership should be designed into the control, not added later as an assumption, because assumptions disappear under pressure. Clear ownership also makes escalation possible, because when a control fails, the organization knows who can fix it. This prevents the common checkbox pattern where everyone claims the control is in place, but nobody can explain who is accountable for its ongoing operation. Measurement is another area where checkbox behavior often hides, because people can measure what is easy instead of what is meaningful. A common mistake is tracking completion metrics, like how many people took training, without tracking whether behavior improved. A more outcome-focused approach uses signals tied to harm and control effectiveness, like whether sensitive data incidents decreased, whether harmful output flags decreased, or whether response time improved when issues were detected. This is where key risk indicator, KRI, and key performance indicator, KPI, thinking matters, because KRI signals rising risk, while KPI signals operational performance that can influence risk. If your dashboard shows that a control was completed but incidents are rising, you should treat that as evidence the control is not working, not as proof the organization is safe. Measurement should create feedback loops that lead to control improvement, because a control that never changes is often a control that was never tested against reality. A practical program measures to learn and adjust, not just to report. The relationship between governance and assurance also influences whether controls become checkboxes. Governance, risk, and compliance, GRC, functions often need to demonstrate that controls exist and are followed, and that can tempt organizations to prioritize documentation over safety. Assurance is valuable, but it becomes harmful when the organization treats passing an assessment as the goal rather than treating risk reduction as the goal. A practical approach uses assurance as a mirror, asking what the evidence shows about how controls operate and where gaps exist. If assurance reveals that teams are copying boilerplate text into risk assessments, that is a signal the process is too heavy or too unclear. If assurance reveals that monitoring alerts are not reviewed, that is a signal the monitoring design is not usable. The right response is to improve controls and workflows so they drive outcomes, not to add more boxes that people will also learn to satisfy superficially. Another practical point is that controls should explicitly support safe speed, meaning they should help teams move faster without increasing exposure. This might sound contradictory until you remember that incidents create the biggest delays of all, because they force feature pauses, public response, legal involvement, and loss of trust. Controls that catch problems early and guide teams to safer designs reduce rework and prevent late-stage surprises. For example, a lightweight intake process that identifies high-risk use cases early prevents teams from building a risky system and then being stopped at the end. A reusable control library prevents teams from reinventing safeguards and making inconsistent choices. Clear decision thresholds reduce debate and accelerate action when risk is high. When controls enable safe speed, teams stop seeing governance as a barrier and start seeing it as part of successful delivery. Practical controls also include clear boundaries for vendors and service providers, because third-party tools can amplify checkbox risk when organizations assume vendor claims replace oversight. If a vendor promises certain protections, the organization still needs a control that verifies key assumptions and defines how the relationship works during incidents. Service Level Agreement, SLA, commitments matter here because monitoring and response depend on timelines and support, not just on policy statements. A practical control might require that vendor incident support is tested, that data handling terms are understood, and that changes in vendor models trigger reassessment. Without these controls, organizations can appear compliant internally while relying on external systems they do not fully understand. When a vendor-related issue occurs, the gap between assumptions and reality becomes visible, and that gap is often what creates reputational and regulatory pressure. Practical governance treats vendors as part of the system, not as a black box that removes responsibility. As we close, the heart of making controls practical is to stop treating control adoption as the finish line and start treating outcome improvement as the finish line. Practical controls are tied to clear objectives, designed for real workflows, and supported by evidence that shows they were performed and had a chance to work. They are proportional to risk, so people do not feel forced into gaming the system, and they are measured by effectiveness rather than by completion. They anticipate realistic failure modes like leakage, harmful outputs, over-reliance, and drift, and they assign ownership so controls remain alive over time. They use measurement to create feedback loops that improve controls instead of producing decorative dashboards. Most importantly, they create safe speed by preventing late surprises and by helping teams deliver value without gambling with high-impact harms. When you can think this way, you can spot checkbox risk quickly and steer governance back toward what matters, reducing harm, building trust, and keeping AI use defensible and safe in the real world.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.